From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Many of the world's problems are so intractable that it's hard to think of ways even to take steps towards mitigating them. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not one of these. On the contrary, the general outlines of a diplomatic solution have been clear for at least 40 years.
We spend the hour with world-renowned linguist and dissident Noam Chomsky in speech and conversation before an audience of 800 in the hall of the UN General Assembly.
In January 2006, a very important event took place, the first full free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. It had one flaw. Came out the wrong way. Hamas won the parliament, control of the parliament. U.S. and Israel didn't want that.
Noam Chomsky for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today we spend the hour with Professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. He's Institute Professor Emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's taught for more than half a century. In October, more than 800 people packed the hall of the UN General Assembly to see Noam Chomsky, ambassadors and the public alike from around the world. The event was hosted by the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Professor Chomsky gave a major address, and I followed with a public interview. First, the speech.
It's a pleasure to be here to be able to talk with you and discuss with you afterwards. Many of the world's problems are so intractable that it's hard to think of ways even to take steps towards mitigating them. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not one of these. On the contrary, the general outlines of a diplomatic solution have been clear for at least 40 years. Not the end of the road, nothing ever is, but a significant step forward. And the obstacles to a resolution are also quite clear. The basic outlines were presented here in a resolution brought to the UN Security Council in January 1976. It called for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, and now I'm quoting, with guarantees for the rights of both states to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. The resolution was brought by the three major Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, sometimes called the confrontation states. Israel refused to attend the session. The resolution was vetoed by the United States. A U.S. veto typically is a double veto. The resolution is not implemented, and the event is vetoed from history. So you have to look hard to find the record, but it is there. That has set the pattern that has continued since. The most recent U.S. veto was in February 2011. That's President Obama, when his administration vetoed a resolution calling for implementation of official U.S. policy, opposition to expansion of settlements, and it's worth bearing in mind that expansion of settlements is not really the issue, it's the settlements, unquestionably illegal, along with the infrastructure projects supporting them. For a long time, there has been an overwhelming international consensus in support of a settlement along these general lines. The pattern that was set in January 1976 continues to the present. Israel rejects a settlement of these terms and for many years has been devoting extensive resources to ensuring that it will not be implemented with the unremitting and decisive support of the United States, military, economic, diplomatic, and indeed ideological, by establishing how the conflict is viewed and interpreted in the United States and within its broad sphere of influence. There's no time here to review the record, but its general character is revealed by a look at what has happened in Gaza in the past decade, carrying forward a long history of earlier crimes. Last August, August 26th, a ceasefire was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And the question on all our minds is, what are the prospects for the future? Well, one reasonable way to try to answer that question is to look at the record. And here, too, there is a definite pattern. A ceasefire is reached, Israel disregards it, and continues its steady assault on Gaza, including continued siege, intermittent acts of violence, more settlement and development projects, often violence in the West Bank. Hamas observes the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, until some Israeli escalation elicits a Hamas response, which leads to another exercise of mowing the lawn in Israeli parlance, each episode more fierce and destructive than the last. The first of the series was the agreement on movement and access in November 2005. I'll give a close paraphrase of it. It called for a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import and export of goods and the transit of people, reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, the reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israel had recently destroyed. These are essentially the terms of successive ceasefires, including the one just reached a few weeks ago. The timing of the November 2005 agreement is significant. This was the moment of Israel's disengagement, as it's called, from Gaza, the removal of several thousand Israeli settlers from Gaza. This is depicted as a noble effort to seek peace and development, but the reality is rather different. The reality was described very quickly by the Israeli official who was in charge of negotiating and implementing the ceasefire, Dov Weissglass, close confidant of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. As he explained to the Israeli press, the goal of the disengagement, I'm quoting him, was the freezing of the peace process so as to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and to ensure that diplomacy has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. The reality on the ground is described by Israel's leading specialists on the occupation, respected historian Idit Zertal, Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent Akiva Eldar wrote the major book, The Standard Work on the Settlement Project. called lords of the land, referring to the settlers. What they say about the disengagement is this. They say the ruined territory, and by then it was ruined, largely part of the reason for the removal of the settlers, the ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and to kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. That's an accurate description from the most respected Israeli source. The Oslo Accords 20 years ago established that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity whose integrity cannot be broken up. For 20 years, the United States and Israel have been dedicated to separate Gaza and the West Bank in violation of the accords that they had accepted. And a look at the map explains why. Gaza offers the only access to the outside world of Palestine. If Gaza is separated from the West Bank, whatever autonomy might ultimately be granted in the West Bank would be imprisoned. Israel on one side, a hostile Jordan, ally of Israel on the other side, and in addition, one of Israel's slow and steady U.S.-backed policies is to take over the Jordan Valley, about a third of the West Bank, much of the arable land, which would essentially imprison the rest even more tightly if Gaza is separated from the West Bank. Now, that's the major geostrategic reason for the Israeli insistence with U.S. backing on separating the two in violation of the Oslo agreements and the series of ceasefires that have been reached since November 2005. Well, the November 2005 agreement lasted for a few weeks. In January 2006, a very important event took place, the first full free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. It had one flaw. It came out the wrong way. Hamas won the parliament, control of the parliament. U.S. and Israel didn't want that. You may recall at that period, the slogan on everyone's lips was democracy promotion. The highest U.S. commitment in the world was democracy promotion. Here was a good test, democracy. Election came out the wrong way. The U.S. instantly decided, along with Israel, to punish the Palestinians for the crime of voting the wrong way. A harsh siege was instituted, other punishments, violence increased. The United States immediately began to organize a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable government. That's quite familiar practice. I won't go through the record. The European Union, to its shame and discredit, went along with this. There was an immediate Israeli escalation. That was the end of the November agreement, followed by major Israeli onslaughts. In 2007, a year later, Hamas committed even a greater crime than winning a fair election. It preempted the planned military coup and took over the Gaza. That's described in the West, in the United States, most of the West, as Hamas's taking over Gaza by force, which is not false, but something is omitted. The force was preempting a planned military coup to overthrow the elected government. That was a serious crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. To preempt a U.S. planned military coup is far more serious. The attack on Gaza increased substantially at that point, major Israeli onslaughts. Finally, in January 2008, another ceasefire was reached. Terms were pretty much the same as those that I quoted. Israel publicly rejected the ceasefire, said that it would not abide by it. Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, despite Israel's refusal to do so. Now, that continued until November 4th, 2008. On November 4th, which was the day of the U.S. election, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That led to Qassam rockets attacking Israel, huge Israeli response, lots of killings, all Palestinians as usual. By the end of December, a couple of weeks later, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. The Israeli cabinet considered it, rejected it. This was a dovish cabinet led by Ehud Olmert, rejected it and decided to launch the next major military operation. That was Cast-led, which was a horrible operation, so much so that it caused a very substantial international reaction, investigations by the United Nations Commission, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. In the middle of this assault, the assault, incidentally, was carefully timed to end immediately before President Obama's inauguration. He had already been elected, but he wasn't inaugurated yet. So when he was asked to comment on the ongoing atrocities, he responded by saying that he couldn't do so. The United States has only one president, and he wasn't president yet. He was talking about lots of other things, but not this. The attack was timed to end immediately before the inauguration, so he therefore could respond to the questions by saying, well, now's not the time to look at the past, let's look forward to the future. Diplomats know very well that that's a standard slogan for those who are engaged in serious crime. Let's forget about the past, let's look forward to a glorious future. Well, that was right in the middle of the assault. The Security Council did pass a resolution unanimously, U.S. abstaining, calling for an immediate ceasefire with the usual terms. That was January 8th, 2009. It was never observed, and it broke down completely with the next major episode of mowing the lawn in November 2012. You can get a good sense of what was going on by looking at the casualty figures for the year 2012. 79 people were killed, 78 of them Palestinians. The usual story.
Noam Chomsky, speaking in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly in an event hosted by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. We'll return to his speech and our conversation in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. In October, MIT professor Noam Chomsky spoke in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly. He talked about the aftermath of the November 2012 Israeli assault on Gaza.
After the November assault, there was a ceasefire reached with the usual terms. I'll describe what happened next by quoting a leading specialist, Nathan Thrall. He's a leading Middle East analyst for the International Crisis Group. As he writes, Israel recognized that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire and therefore saw little incentive in doing the same. The military attacks on Gaza increased, along with more stringent restrictions on imports. Exports were blocked. Exit permits were blocked. That continued until April 2014, when Palestinians committed another crime. Gaza-based Hamas and West Bank-based Palestinian Authority signed a unity agreement. Israel was infuriated even more when the world mostly supported it. Even the United States gave weak but actual support. Several reasons for the Israeli reaction. One is that unity between Gaza and the West Bank, between the two movements, would threaten the long-standing policies of separating the two, for the reasons that I mentioned. Another reason was that a unity government undermines one of the pretexts for Israel's refusal to participate in negotiations seriously, namely, how can we negotiate with an entity that is internally divided? Well, if they're unified, that pretext disappears. Israel was infuriated. It launched major assaults on the Palestinians in the West Bank, primarily targeting Hamas, hundreds of people arrested, mostly Hamas members, also Gaza, also killings. There was a pretext, of course, there always is. The pretext was that three teenagers, Israeli teenagers in the settlements, had been brutally murdered, captured and murdered. Israel claimed officially that they thought that they were alive, so therefore launched a long, several weeks assault in the West Bank, alleging that they were trying to find them alive. Meanwhile, the arrests, attacks, and so on. It turns out that they knew immediately that they had been killed. They also knew immediately that it was very unlikely that Hamas was involved. The government said they had certain knowledge that Hamas had done it, but their own leading specialists, like Shlomo Drury, had pointed out right away that the assault, which was a brutal crime, was very likely committed by members of a breakaway clan, Qasmi clan, in Hebron, which was not given a green light by Hamas and had been a thorn in their sides. And that apparently is true if you look at the later arrests and punishments. Anyway, that was a pretext for this assault. Killings in Gaza too. That finally elicited a Hamas response. Then came Operation Protective Edge, the one which was just completed, more brutal and destructive, even the ones that preceded it. The pattern is very clear, and so far at least it appears to be continuing. The latest ceasefire was reached on August 26th. It was followed at once by Israel's greatest land grab in 30 years, almost 1,000 acres in the Gush Etzion area near what's called Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, about 5 times the size of anything that Jerusalem ever was. taken over by Israel, annexed in violation of Security Council orders. The U.S. State Department informed the Israeli embassy that Israeli, I'm quoting it now, Israeli activity in Gush Etzion undermines American efforts to protect Israel at the United Nations, and urged that Israel shouldn't provide ammunition for those at the United Nations who would interpret Israel's position as hardening. Actually, that warning was given 47 years ago in September 1967, at the time of Israel's first colonization, illegal colonization of Gush Etzion. Israeli historian Gershom Gorenberg recently reminded us of this. Little has changed since, in the last 47 years, apart from the scale of the crimes, which continue without a break with constant U.S. support. Well, as for the prospects, there is a conventional picture. It's repeated constantly on all sides. Israel, Palestine, independent commentators, diplomats. The picture that's presented is that there are two alternatives: either the two-state settlement, which represents an overwhelming international consensus, virtually everyone, and if that fails, there'll have to be one state. Israel will take over the West Bank. The Palestinians will hand over the keys, as it's sometimes said. Palestinians often have favored that. They say then they'll be able to carry out a civil rights struggle, maybe modeled on the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, fight for civil rights within the whole one state controlled by Israel. Israelis criticize that on the grounds of what is called the demographic problem, the fact that there will be too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, in fact, pretty soon a majority. Those are the alternatives that are presented, overwhelmingly, hardly an exception. My own opinion, which I've written about repeatedly without convincing many people apparently, but I'll try to convince you, is that this is a total illusion. Those are not the two alternatives. There are two alternatives, but they're different ones. One alternative is the international consensus on a two-state settlement, basically the terms of January 1976. By now it's virtually everyone. The Arab League, the Organization of Islamic States, includes Iran, Europe, Latin America, formal at least about everyone. That's one option. The other option, the realistic one, is that Israel will continue doing exactly what it is doing right now, before our eyes. It's visible, with U.S. support, which is also visible. And what's happening is not a secret. You can open the newspapers and read it. Israel is taking over what they call Jerusalem, as I mentioned, a huge area, maybe 5 times the area of historic Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, big area in the West Bank, includes many Arab villages being dispossessed, destroyed, bringing settlers in. All of this is doubly illegal. All the settlements are illegal, as determined by the Security Council advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. But the Jerusalem settlements are doubly illegal because they're also in violation of explicit Security Council orders going back to 1968, with the U.S. actually voting for them at that time, barring any change in the status of Jerusalem. But it continues. That's Greater Jerusalem. There are then corridors extending to the east. One major corridor extending from Jerusalem almost to Jericho, virtually bisecting the West Bank, includes the Israeli town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was built largely during the Clinton administration, Clinton years, with the obvious purpose of bisecting the West Bank. Still a little contested territory, but that's the goal. There's another corridor further to the north, including the town of Ariel, partially bisecting what remains, another one further to the north, including the town of Qudumim. If you look at the map, these essentially break up the West Bank into pretty much cantons. It looks from a map as though a large territory is left, but that's misleading. Most of that is uninhabitable desert, and that's separate from what I mentioned before, the slow, steady takeover of the Jordan Valley to the east. Again, about a third of the arable land, the country. Israel has no official policy of taking it over, but they're pursuing the policy in the way that has been carried out now for 100 years, literally. Small steps, so nobody notices, or at least people pretend not to notice. Establish a military zone. The Palestinians who live there have to be displaced because it's a military zone, no settlement allowed. And pretty soon there's a military settlement, Nahal settlement, or another, then sooner or later it becomes an actual settlement. Meanwhile, dig wells, dispossess the population, set up green zones, a large variety of techniques which have by now reduced the Arab population from about 300,000 in 1967 to roughly 60,000 today. As I mentioned, that essentially imprisons what's left. I don't think Israel has any intention of taking over the Palestinian population concentrations, which are left out of these plans. There are analogies often made to South Africa, but they're quite misleading. South Africa relied on its black population. And that was 85% of the population. It was its workforce, and they had to sustain them, just like slave owners have to maintain their capital. They tried to sustain the population. They even tried to gain international support for the Bantustans. Israel has no such attitude toward the Palestinians. They don't want to have anything to do with them. If they leave, that's fine. If they die, that's fine. In standard neo-colonial pattern, Israel is permitting the establishment of a center for Palestinian elites in Ramallah, where you have nice restaurants and theaters and so on. Every third world country under the colonial system had something like that. That's the picture that's emerging. It's taking shape before our eyes. It has so far worked very well. If it continues, Israel will not face a demographic problem. When these regions are integrated slowly into Israel, actually the proportion of Jews in greater Israel will increase. There are very few Palestinians there. Those who are there are being dispossessed, kicked out. That's what's taking shape before our eyes. I think that's the realistic alternative to a two-state settlement, and there's every reason to expect it to continue as long as the United States supports it.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking in October in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly in an event hosted by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. After Chomsky spoke, I interviewed him in front of an audience of 800 at the UN. We'll play highlights of that conversation after this break. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to Noam Chomsky, MIT Institute professor and retired professor of linguistics, world-renowned political dissident and author. In October, Professor Chomsky spoke before 800 people in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly on the issue of Israel and Palestine. After his speech, I did a public interview with Professor Chomsky. We're here at the United Nations General Assembly. What do you think is the single most important action the UN can take to solve the crisis in the occupied territories between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Well, we have to bear in mind what all of you know. In the real world, the United Nations can act insofar as the great powers permit it to act. And in this case, that means primarily the United States, its close ally Britain, France. Those are the main actors. And they set pretty strict limits. But within those limits, there are things that the United Nations could do. Recognizing the state of Palestine is a step forward. Already about, I think, over 130 members of the United Nations have taken that step individually. Just recently, there was the first break in Europe. Sweden announced that they would take that step. Just a couple of days ago, the British Parliament voted to recognize Palestine. Bear in mind that the governing Tory party basically boycotted the election at the request of the Israeli government, which wanted the vote ignored. So it's not a policy change, but it's a significant symbolic move. France has indicated that they might move in that direction. I think these would be important steps. Further steps that could be taken, I think, are to go beyond what has already partially been done. So the European Union, in an important move, did produce a directive calling on member states to avoid any dealings with Israeli institutions that have anything to do with the occupation, which they correctly regard as illegal. So in short, don't participate in criminal acts. That's not an extreme position. That can be done. Several major church groups in the United States, Presbyterians, the Church of Christ, have taken similar positions, also directing themselves against multinationals which are involved in any way in the occupied territories. There's a major boycott being undertaken by major investors of the security firms, the international security firms, which operate in the occupied territories and many other places. All of this could be moved forward to a United Nations resolutions. Possibly even this should be at least tried in the Security Council. If there's a U.S. veto, that's important too, brings forward what's actually happening. All of these are steps that can be undertaken with a recognition that the range of action at the United Nations is, of course, circumscribed by great power politics.
What do you think is the single most important action the United States can take, and what about its role over the years? What is its interest here?
Well, one important action that the United States could take is to live up to its own laws. Of course, it would be nice if it lived up to international law, but maybe that's too much to ask. But live up to its own laws. And there are several. And here, incidentally, I have in mind advice to activists also, who I think ought to be organizing and educating in this direction. There are two crucial cases. One of them is what's called the Leahy Law. Patrick Leahy, Senator Leahy, introduced legislation called the Ley Law, which bars sending weapons to any military units which are involved in consistent human rights violations. There isn't the slightest doubt that the Israeli army is involved in massive human rights violations, which means that all dispatch of U.S. arms to Israel is in violation of U.S. law. I think that's significant. The U.S. should be called upon by its own citizens and by others to adhere to U.S. law, which also happens to conform to international law in this case, as Amnesty International, for example, for years has been calling for an arms embargo against Israel for this reason. These are all steps that can be taken. The second is the tax-exempt status that is given to organizations in the United States which are directly involved in the occupation and in significant attacks on human and civil rights within Israel itself, like the Jewish National Fund. Take a look at its charter with the State of Israel, which commits it to acting for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin within Israel. One of the consequences of that is that by a complex array of laws and administrative practices, the fund pretty much administers about 90% of the land of the country, with real consequences for who can live places. They get tax-exempt status also for their activities in the West Bank, which are strictly criminal. I think that's also straight in violation of U.S. law. Now, those are important things, and I think the U.S. should be pressured internationally and domestically to abandon its virtually unique role, unilateral role in blocking a political settlement for the past 40 years, ever since the first veto in January 1976. That should be a major issue in the media, in convocations like this, in the United Nations, in domestic politics, and government politics, and so on.
The role of the media, can you talk about that, and particularly in the United States? And do you think that the opinion in the United States, public opinion, is shifting on this issue?
Well, the role of the media are somewhat shifting from uniform support for virtually everything that Israel does to, and of course, silence about the U.S. role. That's not just in the case of Israel, that's innumerable other cases as well. But it's slowly shifting, but nevertheless, one about, say, Operation Protective Edge, one can read in news reporting in the New York Times, major journal, a criticism of Hamas's assault on Israel during Protective Edge. Hamas's assault on Israel. Not exactly what happened, but that's what people are reading, and that's the way it's depicted. Israel is over and over, it's pointed out, look, poor Israel is under attack. It has the right of self-defense. Everyone agrees to that. Actually, I agree too. Everyone has a right of self-defense. But that's not the question. The question is, do you have a right of self-defense by force, by violence? The answer is no for anyone, whether it's an individual or a state, unless you have exhausted peaceful means. If you won't even permit peaceful means, which is the case here, then you have no right of self-defense by violence. But try to find a word about that in the media. All you find is self-defense. When President Obama rarely says anything about what's happening, it's usually, if my daughters were being attacked by rockets, I would do anything to stop it. He's referring not to the Palestinian, hundreds of Palestinian children who are being killed and slaughtered, but to the children in the Israeli town of Sderot, which is under attack by Qassam missiles. And remember that Israel knows exactly how to stop those missiles, namely live up to a ceasefire for the first time. And then they would stop, as in the past, even when Israel didn't live up to a ceasefire. That framework, and of course the rest of the framework is the United States is an honest broker trying hard to bring the two recalcitrant sides together, doing its best in this noble endeavor, has nothing to do with the case. The U.S. is, as some of the U.S. negotiators have occasionally acknowledged, Israel's lawyer. If there were serious negotiations going on, they would be led by some neutral party, maybe Brazil, which has some international respect, and they would bring together the two sides. On the one side, Israel and the United States. On the other side, the Palestinians. Those would be possible realistic negotiations. But the chances of anyone in the media either, I won't even say pointing it out, even thinking about it is minuscule. The indoctrination is so deep that really elementary facts like these, and they are elementary, are almost incomprehensible. But to get back to the last point you mentioned, it's very important. Opinion in the United States is shifting. Not as fast as in most of the world, not as fast as in Europe. It's not reaching the point where you could get a vote in Congress, anything like the British Parliament a couple days ago. But it is changing, mostly among younger people, and changing substantially. I'll just illustrate with personal experience. Amy has the same experience. Until pretty recently, when I gave talks on these topics, as I've been doing for 40 years, I literally had to have police protection, even at my own university, MIT. Police would insist on walking me back to my car because of threats they'd picked up. Meetings were broken up and so on. That's all gone. Just a couple of days ago, I had a talk on these topics at MIT. Meeting wasn't broken up, no police protection. Maybe 500 or 600 students were there, all enthusiastic, engaged, committed, concerned, wanting to do something about it. That's happening all over the country. All over the country. Palestinian solidarity is one of the biggest issues on campus. Enormous change in the last few years. That's the way things tend to change. It often starts with younger people. Gradually, it gets to the rest of the population. Efforts of the kind I mentioned, say trying to get the United States government to live up to its own laws, those could be undertaken on a substantial scale, domestically and with support from international institutions, and that could lead to further changes. I think that for example, the two things that I mentioned would have a considerable appeal to much of the American public. Why should they be funding military units that are carrying out massive human rights violations? Why should they be permitting a tax exemption, meaning we pay for it? That's what a tax exemption means. Why should we be compelled to pay for violations of fundamental human rights in another country and even in occupied territories where it's criminal? I think that can appeal to the American population and can lead to the kinds of changes we've seen in other cases.
Noam, if you were writing a reader's guide to accompany the New York Times in its coverage of Israel and Palestine, what advice would you give?
I would tell them to watch Democracy Now! And that wasn't pre-planned.
And if you're wondering where you can watch it, democracynow.org. Final question before we open it up to each of you. Your thoughts on the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, sanctions movement?
Well, the BDS is a set of tactics, right? These are tactics that you employ when you think they're going to be effective and in ways that you think will be effective. Tactics are not principles. They're not actions that you undertake no matter what because you think they're right. Tactics are undertaken if you're serious because you think they're going to help the victims. That's how you adjust your tactics. Not because I think they're right in principle, but because I think they will be beneficial. That ought to be second nature to activists. Also, second nature should be a crucial distinction between proposing and advocating. I can propose now that we should all live in peace and love each other. I just proposed it. It's not a serious proposal. It becomes a serious proposal when it becomes advocacy. It is given, I sketch out a path for getting from here to there. Then it becomes serious. Otherwise, it's empty words. That's crucial and related to this. Well, when you take a look at the BDS movement, which is separate, incidentally, from BDS tactics, let me make that clear. So when the European Union issued its directive, or when that I mentioned, or when, say, the Gates Foundation withdraws investment in security operations that are being carried out not only in the occupied territories but elsewhere, that's very important. But that's not the BDS movement. That's BDS tactics, actually, BD tactics, boycott, divestment tactics. That's important. The BDS movement itself has been an impetus to these developments, and in many ways a positive one, but I think it has failed and should reflect on its so far unwillingness to face what are crucial questions for activists. What's going to help the victims and what's going to harm them? What is a proposal and what is real advocacy? You have to think that through, and it hasn't been sufficiently done. So if you take a look at the principles of the BDS movement, there are three. They vary slightly in wording, but basically three. One is actions should be directed against the occupation. That has been extremely successful in many ways, and it makes sense. It also helps educate the Western populations who are being appealed to participate. It's an opening to discuss, investigate, organize about the participation in the occupation. It's very successful. A second principle is that BDS actions should be continued until Israel allows the refugees to return. That has had no success, and to the extent that it's been tried, it's been negative. It just leads to a backlash. No basis has been laid for it among the population. It is simply interpreted as saying, oh, you want to destroy the state of Israel. We're not going to destroy a state. You cannot undertake actions which you think are principled when in the real world they are going to have a harmful effect on the victims. There's a third category having to do with civil rights within Israel, and there are things that could be done here. One of the ones I mentioned, in fact, the tax-free status for U.S. organizations that are engaged in civil rights and human rights violations. And remember, a tax exemption means I pay for it. That's what a tax exemption is. Well, that's an action that could be undertaken. Others that have been undertaken have had backlashes which are harmful. And I won't run through the record, but these are the kinds of questions that always have to be asked when you're involved in serious activisms if you care about the victims. not just feeling good, but caring about the victims. That's critically important.
We'll end with Ms. Nushen Daria Framke of the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, USA.
Thank you.
Number 2324.
Thank you. I want to thank you for mentioning the Presbyterian Church's vote this summer for the B and the D tactic, as you put it. We voted to divest from the 3 American companies who profit from the occupation. So thanks for mentioning that. And but my question actually is unrelated. How would you respond to the charge that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism?
Actually, the locus classicus, the best formulation of this, was by an ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, in an article that he wrote about 45 years ago, which I urge you to read, which appeared in an American Jewish journal, Congress Weekly, a major journal of the more liberal wing of the American Jewish community. He wrote an interesting article in which he was then UN ambassador from the State of Israel. He advised the American Jewish community that they had 2 tasks to perform. One task was to show that criticism of the policy, what he called anti-Zionism, that means actually criticisms of the policy of the State of Israel, were anti-Semitism. That's the first task. Second task, if the criticism was made by Jews, their task was to show that it's neurotic self-hatred, needs psychiatric treatment. And he gave 2 examples of the latter category. One was I.F. Stone, the other was me. So we have to be treated for our psychiatric disorders, and non-Jews have to be condemned for anti-Semitism if they're critical of the State of Israel. It's understandable why Israeli propaganda would take this position. I don't particularly blame Abba Eban for doing what ambassadors are sometimes supposed to do, but we ought to understand it. There is no sensible charge. No sensible charge. There's nothing to respond to. It's not a form of anti-Semitism. It's simply criticism of the criminal actions of a state. Period.
Well, as we when you have the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone and the leading political dissident in the United States today, Noam Chomsky, criticizing you, you know you have to reconsider your position. It has been wonderful hearing from Professor Noam Chomsky today as you gathered a crowd of hundreds of people to hear you. Thank you so much for being with us. And tune in to democracynow.org, where you can see this whole session as well as other interviews with Professor Chomsky. Thanks so much. MIT professor, world-renowned linguist and dissident Noam Chomsky, speaking in October before 800 people in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly in an event hosted by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. If you'd like a copy of today's show or any of our interviews with Noam Chomsky, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Aaron Mate, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield, Daniel Begun, Anna Ozbek, and Sam Riddell. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, Jessica Lee, David Prude, and Vesta Godars. And to our camera crew, John Randolph, Karen Krug-Meadows, Carla De Jesus, and Phil Raymond. Our website's democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.